They fined me $250,000 for violations on the land I've owned for 30 years. That morning, I just went to check my fence, then found a $250,000 fine pinned to my gate for encroaching on HOA land. 30 years I've lived here, and now they call me the trespasser. What they didn't know? I'm the man who built the dam their whole neighborhood depends on. And when I unrolled my father's old map, every line told the same story. They're living on my land. Morning arrived with the kind of quiet that follows a night of clean wind. Sage and dust lay thin over the pasture. The lake below my porch held a pewter sheen. The cottonwoods along the dam whispered awake. I poured coffee, pulled on my brown jacket, and stepped into boots that know every nail in my gate. The gate is oak. My father hung it when I was 20, and I rebuilt the hinges the week I retired from the dam. The wood carries the scuffs of calves and winters and a life that never asked permission. That's where I saw it. A thick cream envelope pinned to the crossbeam with 2 thumbtacks. For a second, I thought it was a church flyer or a farm circular that drifted wrong. Then I saw the gold foil. Sunset Hills Homeowners Association. Certified mail. The font alone felt expensive enough to make a man apologize before he knew what he'd done. I pulled the envelope free and felt its weight, like it held someone else's confidence. Cows shifted in the pasture. The stock tank ticked. I slit the flap with my pocket blade. New paper smell rose like disinfectant. The first sheet snapped in the breeze. Official notice of violation. The numbers hit before the words, $250,000. They'd written it with a comma and a period, as if punctuation made it gentle. I read the rest with elbows on the gate. Encroachment on HOA green space. Unauthorized structures within setback. Non-compliant fencing previously warned. It was almost funny. I let out a short, flat laugh. The sound a man makes when he bumps the table in the dark, because they were fining me on land I'd fenced before those houses had roofs. 30 years I've kept this place alive through drought and flood. My irrigation kept the meadow green when their sod rolled out like carpet. Trespasser, the letter called me. Heat rose slow as a kettle. I carried the packet to the tailgate. The letterhead was smug with bylaws. It cited a 2011 survey, updated boundaries, a committee vote I'd never been invited to. There were photographs, my tool shed squat against sky, the dam gate like a dark grin, my fence running true along the hill. Red circles around each, labels like evidence. Page 2 sharpened the knife. Failure to comply will result in daily penalties, liens, and possible forced sale. Beyond the gate, the new road curled up from the subdivision, where houses sat in neat rows the color of sand. Cranes stooped over the far hill. A woman in a turquoise suit talked into a phone by a black SUV, red clipboard tucked under her arm. From here, she looked like a pin dropped on a map that didn't include me. On the porch rail, a tin of my father's old survey stakes glinted. I've been retired from dam engineering 6 years, but a man never retires from measuring. When your life is water and fall lines, you learn to hear how things fit. I set the notice aside and lifted the tin. The stakes clinked. Under them lay my deed, dated 1974, my father's signature, a tired river. I spread the deed on the tailgate and traced the legal description the way some men trace photographs. Beginning at the northeast corner marked by cottonwood, thence south 80 rods to the creek, thence west, words that sound like direction and scripture. Coordinates don't pray, they tell. The memory of the spillway gate in my hands, the clean resistance of steel against moving water, came back so clear I could smell the oil. This land is not abstract to me, never a number massaged until a development fits. It is oak and gravel and head pressure. It is the difference between flood and field. I read the fine again because men repeat what they can't believe. $250,000. I thought of Jane, the way she tucked letters into the blue bowl by the sink and said not all paper deserved attention. She's been gone 3 winters, but I could hear the smile. Read the line that matters, Jake. So I did. Attached survey, 2011. Boundary adjustment. That was the line. Not the fine, not the threat. The map. I thumbed to the back and found it. A clean grid with confidence thicker than the paper. I held it beside the deed and felt annoyance chill. The 2011 lines shaved a bite out of my northern pasture, ran west across my fence and looped the dam access road like a noose. According to their map, my oak gate, the one holding their letter, sat inside their green space. I folded their map and slipped it back into the packet. From the glove box, I pulled a leather notebook and wrote the date, the fine, and the phrase they used so casually. Forced sale. There are times a man argues and times a man measures. I know the difference. I slid the deed into its sleeve and closed the tin. The hinge clicked like a small verdict. I walked the fence east, counting posts by feel. Cedar, cedar, split oak where the bull leaned one spring. At the cottonwood, I knelt and pressed my palm to the earth where my father set the first iron. A faint depression marked where a stake once stood and had no reason to move. I took out my pocket compass, laid it on the deed, and let north settle. The needle stilled like a held breath. Down the road, the SUV door thumped. The woman in turquoise turned, clipboard bright as a wound. She held the posture of someone who believes paper is heavier than ground. I brushed grass from my knees. A breeze pushed a sheet from the packet and sent it skittering against the fence. I caught it and smoothed the crease. 30 years on this land, and they call me a trespasser. I'm not a man who enjoys fights. I prefer dams that hold, gates that swing, and neighbors who wave with their whole hand. But there are lines no one gets to redraw with a meeting and a marker. The lake gave a silver shiver. Sun nudged past the ridge and laid a pale coin on the dam's capstones. My coffee cooled. I looked at the fine one last time and felt the anger flatten into something useful. Quiet anger is like water behind a gate. Not loud, not showy, but it gathers. I slid the packet back into the envelope and pinned it to the gate where I'd found it. Then I brought the tin of steaks and set it beside the envelope, an appointment between yesterday and today. Between the cottonwood and the dam, a quail flushed. My boots found the path I take when something needs thinking, down toward the spillway where water becomes sentences. The envelope and the tin sat on the gate together, 2 truths the wind couldn't edit. I drew a breath big enough to last a day and let it out slow. Why would they risk finding a man who built the land they're living on? By noon, the wind had gone dry and the sky pressed low, the kind of pale blue that makes everything seem exposed. I was mending the hinge on the barn door when gravel crunched out front. Through the open slats, I saw a black SUV glide up the drive like it owned the dust. Chrome flashed, and a woman stepped out, the kind who makes the air shift just by looking around. She wore a turquoise skirt suit, heels sharp enough to dig post holes, and sunglasses that hid the eyes but not the intent. A red clipboard hung under her arm like a holster. 2 men in matching navy blazers followed, both carrying cameras and expressions too careful to be friendly. "Mr. Remy?" she called, voice cutting through the stillness. I straightened and wiped my hands on a rag. "That's me." She gave a polite smile, the kind that announces bad news before it's spoken. "Bethany Whitfield, president of the Red Maple Estates Homeowners Association. We're here to review your violations in person before legal action proceeds." Her tone carried the same sweetness as a barbed wire fence. "Violations," I said, letting the word roll once. "You mean the fence my father built? The shed I fixed last spring? And the dam gate that keeps half this valley dry?" Bethany's smile didn't move. The structures on record are in non-compliance with community setbacks. The committee voted unanimously to enforce standards. I'm sure you understand. It's about maintaining property values. The two men began snapping pictures. One crouched by the fence, the other zoomed in on my chicken coop like he'd found a crime scene. I leaned against the barn post, keeping my voice level. This land was platted long before your subdivision sprouted up. I've got the deeds to prove it. Bethany took a step closer, the gravel crunching like punctuation. Mr. Remy, boundaries evolve with development. The 2011 survey updated the lines. You're technically encroaching on HOA green space. That word again, encroaching, as if land could forget who held it first. I've been here 30 years, I said. I don't recall signing away my fence line to a committee. She gestured toward the dam road behind my pasture. Your access road crosses community property. The board expects removal within 30 days or will file for lien placement. I caught a flicker of unease in one of the men's faces, young, uncomfortable. Bethany noticed too and straightened. I walked to the gate where her SUV idled. Tell me something, I said, tapping the clipboard she clutched. Who drew your lines? Our contracted surveyor, she replied briskly. All official, all verified by county records. Then I'd like to see the signatures, I said. She hesitated just long enough to let truth peek through. Then she shrugged, feigning confidence. It's all in the file, Mr. Remy. You'll receive full copies with the court summons if it comes to that. Heels clicked as she turned toward the SUV. The men followed, whispering notes. At the door, she paused and looked back at my gate, the envelope still pinned there like a dare. I advise compliance. These fines only grow heavier with time. Like guilt, I said quietly. She pretended not to hear. They drove off, dust folding behind them. The sound lingered longer than the engine. I stood by the fence a while, feeling the weight of every board my father had sunk into this ground. Out across the field, sunlight hit the dam, bright and hard. That structure had outlived storms, lawsuits, and one near collapse during the flood of '98. But this felt different. Paper storms could rot foundations faster than rain. Inside, I pulled open my old roll-top desk. Maps lay stacked beneath yellowed inspection sheets. The top one bore the U.S. Army Corps watermark and my father's neat block handwriting. Remy Ranch Holdings, Survey 1974. I spread it flat, edges curling like memory. The coordinates formed a square that wrapped the lake, the dam, and a wide strip of meadow stretching to the hill where Red Maple Estates now sat. My thumb traced the northern boundary, still marked by that cottonwood tree Ernest and I had planted after the fire. The HOA map had sliced that same line 30 feet south, stealing a piece of the lake and my access road. I felt the same quiet anger as before, but this time it carried focus. I dug deeper in the desk drawer until my fingers found cold metal, a brass compass, scuffed but steady. It had guided me through 1,000 site surveys, from frozen riverbanks to desert reservoirs. I flipped it open. The needle quivered, found north, and held. Outside, the wind lifted again, brushing dust against the porch rail. The world keeps its bearings, I thought, even when people lose theirs. Ernest's voice came faintly across the pasture. He was calling to his dog, same as every afternoon. I grabbed the map and walked toward the fence line. Ernest was already there, leaning on his cane, his hat tilted against the sun. "Afternoon, Jake," he said. "Saw the fancy car. Trouble?" "HOA," I said. "They're fining me for my own fence." He spat into the dirt. "That fence has been there since before they had pavement up the hill. I remember your old man driving those posts myself." "Bethany Whitfield doesn't care much for history," I said. "Says there's a 2011 survey that rewrote everything." Ernest chuckled low, I'd like to see the fella who took it. Probably never dirtied his boots. We stood a while, the wind carrying the smell of hay and lake water. Finally, I rolled up the map. I'm thinking I'll find out who did. Ernest nodded toward the horizon. Be careful. Folks with money draw maps to fit their fences. I smiled. And folks like me measure fences to fit the truth. That night, I cleared the kitchen table, laid out the deed beside the old survey, and wrote a note to myself in the ledger margin. If they moved the lines, they left tracks. I folded the papers back into their sleeves, turned off the light, and watched the moon cut across the dam wall. Something in that glow said the quiet wouldn't last. By dawn, I was already up, the kettle hissing low on the stove. The air held that early chill you can only find near water before the sun remembers its job. A coyote barked from the ridge, answered by the low call of a mourning dove. I sat at the kitchen table, spreading the 1974 deed beneath the soft pool of lamplight. It wasn't just paper. It was a record of memory, inked lines holding 30 years of sweat. My father's pencil notes still smudged in the margins. Each coordinate told a story. The old cottonwood, the stone marker by the creek, the fence corner built before asphalt touched this valley. When the mail truck rattled by, I tucked the deed into a leather folder and slipped on my hat. The world outside was sharp and still, the kind of morning where you can hear your own thoughts trying to outrun the wind. Ernest's pickup was already parked by the cottonwood. He stood beside it, leaning on his cane, studying something near the roots. "Morning, Jake," he said. "You ever notice how they don't make paper thick enough to hold what's true?" He pointed to a faint line in the dirt. There, half swallowed by grass, was a sliver of rusted metal, one of the old survey stakes. I knelt and brushed away soil until the iron glinted through. "There she is," I murmured. Ernest nodded. "Same place it's been since your daddy drove it in. I remember we were standing right here, July heat burning our necks, and he said, 'This stake marks what a man works for, not what he borrows.'" I smiled. He wasn't wrong. We followed the fence east. Every 40 yards I'd kneel, check the line, and mark it with orange twine. The air smelled of sun on wire and old timber. Past the creek, the ground rose, and from there I could see the new mansions stacked like bleached bones above the valley. That's when the anger came back. Not loud, just steady, coiled tight behind my ribs. Those houses glittered where pasture used to run. It wasn't the houses themselves that hurt. It was the idea that paper and arrogance could overwrite sweat and memory. I drove into town after lunch, dust trailing like smoke behind the truck. The courthouse sat square on Main, its stone facade cracked but proud. Inside, the air tasted of old varnish and quiet disapproval. I walked straight to the records office. The clerk looked up from her monitor, glasses sliding down her nose. "Morning. What can I help you with?" "I'm looking for all surveys filed for Red Maple Estates around 2011, I said. She raised an eyebrow. "You the owner of one of those lots?" "Not exactly," I said. "I'm the owner of the land they built them on." Her lips twitched into the ghost of a smile. "Well, that's a new one." She disappeared into the back, the sound of drawers opening echoing like muffled thunder. When she returned, she laid out 2 thick folders and 1 slim envelope stamped with county seals. "This is everything filed for that development," she said. "Funny thing, though, one of the surveys doesn't list a license number for the certifying engineer. Just initials." I opened it, heart slowing into something heavy. The signature was a scribble, D.L. Frey, dated March 2011. The address led nowhere, just a P.O. box. I flipped to the seal, faint, smudged, and missing the state registration code every legitimate surveyor includes. "Mind if I make a copy of this?" I asked. She nodded. 50 cents a page. I slid a dollar bill across the counter. Keep the change. Back home, I spread both maps, the forged one from the HOA and the 1974 deed, side by side on the kitchen table. The difference jumped out like a crack in concrete. The newer map shaved 60 feet off my north line and cut my access road in half. A tidy theft disguised as modernization. The house settled with a groan as I traced the new coordinates with a red pencil. Each stroke felt like reopening an old wound. I went outside, stood under the cottonwood again, and looked across the water. The dam glimmered under the afternoon sun, steady as always. Sometimes I think that dam and I grew old together. It had scars, too, patchwork repairs from the flood years, a new sluice gate I'd welded after the county inspector called it unsafe. It stood because we didn't back down when things cracked. The wind carried a faint sound from the hill, construction hammers, voices shouting. I could just make out the glint of metal stakes in fresh earth near the Whitfield mansion. I took a deep breath. They were still building on what wasn't theirs. I went inside and found my father's old field kit in the closet. Leather cracked, tools clean. The brass compass sat nested beside a worn steel tape and a small metal detector. The sight of it brought back younger days, surveying riverbanks, feeling the satisfaction of a stake driven true. As evening fell, I sat on the porch, the kit beside me watching the lake darken to ink. Coyotes called again in the distance. My hand rested on the compass lid, thumb rubbing the initials carved faintly into brass. JRR. Senior. The metal felt warm, alive, like an inheritance of certainty. The first stars flickered through the haze. I reached for the survey papers and folded them neatly. This wasn't just about fines or fences. It was about whether truth could still stand when money tried to redraw it. A single light shone up the hill from Bethany's mansion. I could picture her inside, phone pressed to her ear, making plans that didn't include the man she thought she'd cornered. The dam's spillway whispered steady below. The night smelled of iron and pine and coming rain. I knew then what I'd do tomorrow. If the proof was buried under their lawns, I'd dig it out myself. By sunrise, the clouds had rolled in low and heavy, turning the sky the color of old tin. I loaded the truck bed with my father's field kit, a coil of rope, and the metal detector that still hummed like a living thing when you flicked the switch. The air felt thick with promise, or warning. When I reached the Ridge Road, the red maple estates spread beneath me like a picture in a glossy magazine. Manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, driveways wide enough for parties. But to me, the whole neighborhood looked slightly crooked, like a frame hung on a wall that no one bothered to straighten. Marcus Reed was waiting by the cattle gate at the edge of my property. He'd been a carpenter most of his life, built porches and barns from Wyoming to the Dakotas, and took up surveying part-time after his knees gave out. His pickup rattled, his coffee steamed, and his grin was lopsided. "You sure you want to poke this hornet's nest, Jake?" he asked. "I'm just measuring," I said. "Truth don't sting unless you've been lying." He chuckled and handed me a thermos. "Then let's measure." We started from the cottonwood, where the first stake still stood proud of the dirt. Marcus set up his modern GPS receiver, sleek black, satellite-fed, humming softly, like a distant generator. I brought out the old steel tape, because sometimes new truth needs old hands to guide it. For every reading he took, I cross-checked by sight and compass. The smell of wet earth rose as we worked, soft thuds of our boots blending with the metallic tick of the detector. Each time it pinged, Marcus knelt, brushed away grass, and exposed rusted iron capped with initials that matched the 1974 deed. "These babies haven't moved a hair," he said. "Then somebody else did," I replied. By noon, we'd reached the invisible border where the manicured estates began. A curved stone sign announced, "Welcome to Red Maple Estates, where nature meets luxury." The irony sat thick enough to taste. I parked just beyond the sign and stared across the property lines that were never supposed to be in question. One of the mansion owners, a man named Cross, waved from his front porch, mistaking us for landscapers. Marcus waved back, smile polite, eyes sharp. We stepped into the yard, metal detector sweeping in smooth arcs. Within minutes, it chirped. Marcus crouched, knife flashing silver as he dug through sod until something clanged. He pried up a corroded stake stamped Remy 74. It had been buried nearly 3 feet deep beneath layers of imported soil. He looked up. "This is your line, Jake. Their pool's sitting 10 yards over it." I felt my jaw tighten. The infinity pool shimmered, turquoise like Bethany's suit, its edge bleeding right into the horizon. Beyond it, the tennis court and patio loungers stretched onto what used to be my father's field. "They built paradise on borrowed ground," Marcus muttered. We marked each uncovered stake with a red flag, bright dots against the perfect green. By the time we reached the second mansion, my notebook brimmed with coordinates and measurements. Everyone matched my deed, not their survey. The afternoon wore on. Storm clouds pressed low enough to brush the tree line. At the third property, the detector shrieked loud. We dug and found another stake, but this one had been sawed clean in half, fresh cut, too. Marcus whistled through his teeth. Someone tried to make it disappear. I stared at the clean metal edge. They knew it was here. The sky cracked then, a thunderhead rolling over the ridge, scattering birds like startled paper. We packed our gear and took shelter under the porch of an unfinished house. Rain fell hard, bouncing off the concrete like applause. "Jake," Marcus said after a while, his voice low, "this ain't just sloppy surveying. This is deliberate. Someone redrew your map and sold the story as law." I nodded. The truth fit too cleanly to ignore. "I'll find who signed it, and they'll have to answer to more than mud." When the rain eased, we went back out, boots sinking in the new slick earth. Water pooled in the divots we'd dug, reflecting the stormlight. Marcus snapped photos, each flag, each uncovered stake, each coordinate glowing on his GPS screen. At dusk, we stood on the rise above the estates, the whole valley washed gold by the breaking sun. The red flags fluttered like small defiant flames scattered across the manicured lawns. "Looks like a war map," Marcus said softly. "Not war," I told him. "Just the truth, finally showing its colors." He gave me a sideways look. "Bethany's not going to like this." "She doesn't have to," I said. "She just has to see it." That night I spread the day's findings across my kitchen table. Photos, coordinates, the original deed, the copied survey. Under the lamplight, they told a story so clear it made my pulse slow. 5 mansions sitting partially or wholly on land I owned. My fence wasn't the trespasser. Their walls were. I took a clean sheet of paper and began drafting a letter to the county assessor's office, requesting an official review of boundary discrepancies. But before I finished, a thought pulled me back to the phony signature. D.L. Frey. Something about it wouldn't rest. I searched the state engineer's registry online. The screen glowed in the dark room. I typed the name, waited, and watched the list scroll. No record. I tried again. The registry returned a notice. License expired 2008. Deceased. The survey had been filed 3 years after that date. Lightning flashed outside, bleaching the windows. The truth came together in the same instant the thunder hit. The HOA's official survey had been signed by a dead man. I leaned back, heart steady but eyes burning. Somewhere up on that hill, Bethany was probably sipping wine, feeling safe behind forged lines. Tomorrow, she'd learn how wrong she was. I leaned back, heart steady but eyes burning. Somewhere up on that hill, Bethany was probably sipping wine, feeling safe behind forged lines. Tomorrow, she'd learn how wrong she was. The morning broke dry and cold. The rain had scrubbed the air clean, leaving the smell of sage sharp enough to taste. I loaded the truck with my maps, the GPS logs, and Marcus's photographs, then headed toward the subdivision. The road curled through rolling pasture before turning to new asphalt. Up ahead, the community center stood gleaming, its glass doors reflecting the pale sun. Cars already filled the lot, SUVs, sedans, and one glossy convertible parked sideways across two spaces, the kind of confidence money buys. Inside, the hall hummed with voices. People milled beneath recessed lighting, coffee cups in hand, the hum of polite outrage echoing off walls lined with framed photos of ribbon cuttings and charity events. At the front stood a long table covered in white cloth. The board members sat like a jury behind nameplates, Bethany at the center, posture immaculate. Her turquoise suit had been replaced by charcoal gray, but the eyes behind those glasses were the same, sharp, unwavering, rehearsed. Two attorneys flanked her, one typing notes into a tablet, the other whispering close to her ear. When she saw me, her lips curved slightly, just enough to look like control. "Mr. Remy," she called into the microphone, her voice calm, deliberate. "We appreciate you coming voluntarily. This meeting will allow us to clarify certain issues before legal steps are taken." I nodded once and took a seat near the aisle. Around me, neighbors watched, some curious, others cautious. I recognized a few faces from the market in town, now tight with discomfort. In every HOA meeting, there's always the same mix: the followers, the fearful, and the few who know better but stay quiet. Bethany cleared her throat. "For record purposes," she continued, "Mr. Remy's violations include fence encroachment, unauthorized structures, and improper access through community-maintained property. The fines total $250,000 pending correction." Her lawyer slid a glossy photo onto the projector screen. My dam gate, my fence, my chicken coop, each outlined in red like a crime scene. "Before we proceed," Bethany said smoothly, "do you have anything to add?" I stood slowly, hat in hand, and walked to the front. The air seemed to tighten as I set my briefcase on the podium. "I do," I said. "A few measurements, maybe a truth or two." The audience tittered, half amusement, half discomfort. Bethany's smile froze just enough to show the effort it took. I opened the laptop Marcus and I had used in the field, connected it to the HDMI cable, and clicked to the first slide. Aerial photos filled the screen, satellite images overlaid with GPS boundaries glowing red. Gasps fluttered through the room. "These," I said, "are the original property lines established in 1974, verified last week by certified GPS coordinates. Each red dot marks an original survey stake buried under your landscaped yards." Someone in the audience whispered, "That's my pool." I clicked again. The map zoomed in on the Whitfield mansion. The bright turquoise shimmer of her infinity pool sat squarely over the red outline of my property. Bethany straightened. "Mr. Remy, I don't know where you obtained these materials, but—" "I obtained them," I said, my tone quiet but cutting. "From the ground. From the same iron stakes your developer buried to hide what he'd stolen." The room shifted. A ripple of murmurs, people leaning forward, phones raised discreetly to record. One of Bethany's attorneys whispered rapidly. The other began scrolling through a legal pad, looking for a place to start unraveling this. I clicked to the next image. Marcus, standing beside the half-sawn stake, time-stamped, GPS coordinates visible. "That was taken 2 days ago," I said. "This marker was deliberately cut to erase a boundary. The coordinates match the 1974 deed on file with the county." Bethany's composure cracked. Barely, but enough to show the edge of panic. "These are unverified claims, Mr. Remy. Amateur fieldwork." "Then maybe this will sound more professional," I said. and held up a printed copy of the 2011 survey she'd cited, the one signed by D.L. Fro. According to the state registry, this man died in 2008, which makes him the only surveyor in Montana who kept working 3 years after his funeral. The audience erupted, a buzz of shock and disbelief. Bethany's lawyers jumped in, trying to regain control. "That's enough," one began, but Bethany raised a trembling hand. "I don't know where you got that document," she said through clenched teeth. "From your violation notice," I replied. "You sent it to me." Silence fell so heavy you could hear the hum of the projector fan. I looked over the crowd, faces pale, some turning toward her, others whispering. Even the ones who'd smirked earlier now avoided her eyes. Then a voice from the back broke the stillness. "Bethany, is that true?" It was one of the homeowners, a man in a golf shirt whose property sat just uphill from mine. "Did we build on his land?" Bethany didn't answer. Her hands tightened on the edge of the table, knuckles white. I turned to the crowd. "I'm not here to ruin anyone's home. I'm here because someone tried to erase mine. The truth's in those coordinates, not in fancy bylaws or doctored maps." From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Bethany's phone vibrating across the table. She glanced down. On the screen, a name flashed. Preston Hale, her developer. For a heartbeat, she hesitated, then silenced it and slid the phone face down. Too late. Everyone saw. That was the moment the room turned. Not loud, not sudden, just a slow, collective exhale, as if the whole neighborhood realized they'd been living inside a lie, drawn with perfect lines and fake signatures. I closed the laptop, the screen fading to black. "I'll let the county sort it out," I said, picking up my hat. "They still believe in laws that don't vanish under bulldozers." As I walked out, the hum of whispered questions followed me like a tailwind. Behind me, Bethany was already on her phone, voice sharp, brittle. I caught just enough to hear the name again, Preston Hale, and the word survey. Outside, the light felt strange, too bright after that room. Marcus leaned against my truck, watching me approach. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Like turning on a floodgate," I said. He grinned. "Hope they can swim." The wind carried the scent of rain again, faint but building. Somewhere behind us, the doors to the community hall slammed. I didn't turn around. Some truths, once released, don't need to be watched. They just run downhill on their own. The wind carried the scent of rain again, faint but building. Somewhere behind us, the doors to the community hall slammed. I didn't turn around. Some truths, once released, don't need to be watched. They just run downhill on their own. That night, the valley went quiet. Not peaceful quiet, watchful quiet. You can always tell when people are talking about you behind closed doors. Lights stayed on later than usual up on the hill. Car headlights flashed in short bursts, and a single truck idled by my fence before creeping away. I sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee, the kind that tastes like old iron, and watched the lake catch the last of the storm glow. Somewhere beyond that water, Bethany was probably pacing her marble floors, phone in hand, calling lawyers, developers, anyone who might sew the edges back together before dawn. Marcus called just before midnight. "You stirred the hive good, Jake," he said, his voice low. "Saw 3 of their board members drive out to Hale's office tonight. Guess they're planning damage control." "They can plan all they want," I said. "Truth's already out." He exhaled through the line. "You should still be careful. Folks like that, they get desperate when their paper walls start to fold." I looked at the faint outline of my dam in the distance, dark and patient against the horizon. "That's the thing about walls, Marcus," I said. "If they're built on stolen ground, they fall easy." By morning, the clouds had rolled back, leaving a washed-out sky that made everything too bright to look at for long. The mailbox rattled when the truck went by. I knew that sound. Official paper. Sure enough, a certified envelope waited inside. County seal, return address from the district court. Inside, a notice of pending civil action. Remy versus Red Maple Estates, HOA. Attached was a summons to appear for an injunction hearing. It was happening faster than I expected. They were trying to get ahead of me, turn offense into defense. I smiled despite myself. That meant they were scared. I folded the papers neatly and called Sarah Coleman. She picked up on the second ring, her voice brisk and steady like someone who ran on coffee and deadlines. "Mr. Remy," she said, "I've been expecting your call. You heard already? The clerk's office doesn't keep secrets long in small counties. Looks like they filed a temporary restraining order, claiming you trespassed during your unauthorized surveying." "Unauthorized," I repeated. "On my land." She laughed softly. "That's why we're going to court, Mr. Remy. You have proof, and I have experience making people eat their own paperwork. Bring everything tomorrow. Original deed, GPS logs, photographs. The judge scheduled a preliminary hearing for 9. Tomorrow? Yes. Don't be late. And try not to start any more neighborhood revolutions between now and then." I almost smiled. No, promises. The next morning broke with mist crawling across the dam and a light drizzle that felt like whispers against the brim of my hat. I loaded the truck with everything Sarah asked for and headed into town. Each turn of the wheels kicked up gravel like tiny gunshots in the wet air. At the courthouse, Sarah met me on the steps. She was younger than I expected, mid-30s maybe, with dark hair tied back and a look that could sand rough edges off a man's temper. She wore a navy suit and boots that weren't afraid of mud. "You look like you brought the whole county," she said, eyeing the stack of folders in my arms. "Just the truth," I said. "It tends to weigh more than lies." Inside, the air carried that blend of disinfectant and old paper only courthouses know. We took our seats near the front. Across the aisle, Bethany sat with her lawyers, 3 of them this time. She didn't look at me, just kept her eyes on her phone. But I caught the twitch in her jaw when the bailiff called the session to order. Judge Ramirez presided, a calm man with a silver beard and the patience of someone who'd seen too many people try to twist right into wrong. He flipped through the file, glasses low on his nose. "Ms. Whitfield," he said, voice firm but even, "your association alleges that Mr. Remy entered HOA property without authorization, damaged landscaping, and interfered with homeowners' quiet enjoyment. You're requesting a restraining order. Is that correct?" Bethany's attorney stood. "Yes, Your Honor. His actions have caused distress and confusion among residents. We ask the court to prevent further disruption while we clarify boundary discrepancies." The judge nodded, then turned to Sarah. "Counselor?" Sarah rose, calm but sharp. "Your Honor, this case is built on a fraudulent survey signed by a man who's been deceased for over a decade. My client possesses the original deed, verified coordinates, and recorded markers dating back 50 years. If anyone's trespassing, it's the HOA, onto land they don't own." The courtroom rustled, a few gasps breaking the composure. Bethany's face tightened. Judge Ramirez lifted an eyebrow. "A deceased surveyor?" Sarah handed him the document. Filed in 2011, bearing the name and seal of one D.L. Frey, whose license expired in 2008. The county registrar can confirm both the expiration and the date of death. The judge studied the papers a long moment before setting them down. "I see." Bethany's lawyer tried to recover, stammering about administrative oversight, clerical errors, and complex land adjustments. But the damage was done. When the hearing adjourned, the judge announced he'd issue a temporary hold. No construction, no property changes, no further fines, until a full review could be conducted. I exhaled slowly. It wasn't victory yet, but it was solid ground under my boots. Outside, the sky broke open just enough to let sunlight spill over the courthouse steps. Reporters were already waiting, local paper types with notebooks and cameras. Sarah spoke first, brief and careful, then nodded for me to follow. One of the reporters, a young woman with freckles and a windblown notepad, asked, "Mr. Remy, how does it feel taking on the entire HOA?" I looked past her to the distant ridge where red maple estates glittered in the afternoon haze. "It's not about taking anyone on," I said. "It's about setting things straight. The land remembers who listens." That night, the valley was quiet again, but this time it felt earned. I sat on the porch, rain drying in streaks across the railing, and listened to the frogs tuning up near the dam. For the first time in weeks, the anger had thinned into something else: resolve. The fight was far from over, but I could feel the balance shifting. Paper had teeth, but truth had roots, and roots, given time, break through anything. 2 weeks passed like a long inhale before the storm. Every morning I walked the fence line, tracing where red survey flags fluttered against the breeze. Each one was a scar turned into a statement. By the time the official trial date arrived, the land itself felt ready. The lake was low, the grass dry, and the air smelled faintly of iron, like something buried too long was about to rise again. Sarah met me outside the courthouse, her hands full of binders thick as cinder blocks. "Ready?" she asked. "I've been ready since they called me a trespasser," I said. "Good," she smiled, "because this is where they start playing dirty." Inside, the courtroom hummed with low tension. Every seat was filled, neighbors, reporters, even a few county officials pretending they weren't curious. Bethany sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by her trio of attorneys in expensive suits. She looked smaller than I remembered, her confidence drawn tight as a bowstring. Judge Ramirez entered, robe sweeping the dust off memory. His voice, calm but heavy, filled the room. "This court will determine ownership and legitimacy of boundary surveys between Mr. Jake Remy and the Red Maple Estates Homeowners Association." Sarah began with quiet precision. She laid out my father's original deed, then the GPS overlays Marcus and I had documented. Each map appeared on the courtroom projector, glowing red lines against pale blue land. She explained the process, the coordinates, the metal stakes, the verification through modern satellite data. "Your Honor," she said, "these points aren't opinions. They're math. Math doesn't care about money, signatures, or HOA bylaws." I sat still, watching the jurors' eyes follow her every word. Some nodded unconsciously, as if the simplicity of truth felt like a relief. Then it was their turn. Bethany's lead lawyer, a tall man named Clarkson with hair as slick as his tone, rose and approached the witness stand where Marcus was seated. "Mr. Reed," Clarkson said smoothly, "you're a carpenter by trade, correct?" "Was," Marcus replied. "Now I'm a certified surveyor." Clarkson smiled like a snake, showing polite teeth. "Self-taught, are you?" "Certified by the state," Marcus said. "License number's right there." Clarkson waved a dismissive hand. "Let's talk about your equipment. GPS readings, satellite data, all this fancy tech. You claim these methods are foolproof?" "They're verifiable within inches," Marcus said. "That's better than the surveys your client filed." Clarkson turned to the jury. "Better than human expertise, ladies and gentlemen? Machines over men? Seems a dangerous precedent to trust cold numbers over professional judgment." Sarah stood before the objection could even echo. "Objection, mischaracterization. My client's evidence is professional judgment, backed by certified technology and state-licensed procedure." "Sustained," Judge Ramirez said. The lawyer retreated a step, clearly annoyed. "Then perhaps we can discuss this mysterious deceased surveyor. Mr. Frey, was it? Do you have proof of his death?" Sarah didn't flinch. "Filed death certificate, 2008. County record." Would you like to see it again? The courtroom chuckled softly. Bethany's face hardened. Then came my turn on the stand. Sarah guided me through the story, careful and deliberate. I spoke about my father's survey, the stakes we set, the nights spent measuring by lantern light when money was thin but pride was steady. I described the first time I saw the forged map, the feeling of holding something that stole without noise. When Sarah handed me a photo of Bethany's pool cutting across my boundary, she said, "Mr. Remy, what does this represent to you?" I looked at it a long time. "It represents forgetting," I said finally. "Forgetting where things start and end. My father used to say land isn't about ownership, it's about responsibility. They forgot that." The courtroom went quiet. Even Clarkson didn't have a retort ready. Bethany's lawyers countered with experts of their own, surveyors in suits who spoke in careful, evasive jargon. But when Sarah asked each one to verify the license number of the 2011 Frey survey, they shifted in their seats. Not one could explain how a dead man's stamp ended up on an HOA document. By mid-afternoon, the mood had turned. The air felt heavier, like the room itself knew where this was going. Then, in a twist that even Sarah didn't expect, a clerk entered and handed the judge a sealed folder. Ramirez skimmed it, eyebrows lifting slightly. "This," he said, "appears to be newly recovered correspondence between the developer, Mr. Preston Hale, and the HOA board from 2011. The room rippled. Bethany whispered sharply to her attorneys, but the judge raised a hand. "Admissible," he said. Sarah approached the bench. Inside were printed emails complete with timestamps and signatures. One line stood out bold against the ink. Shift markers to align parcels with marketing lots before inspection. Don't worry about the old deed. No one checks the dead man's math. The silence that followed was the kind that changes everything. Bethany closed her eyes briefly, the color draining from her face. Sarah turned to the jury, her voice soft but firm. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen, this is not an accident. It's fraud dressed in landscaping." Judge Ramirez dismissed us for the day shortly after. Outside, the late light painted the courthouse steps in amber and dust. Sarah exhaled beside me, shoulders loosening for the first time all day. "You did good in there," she said. "That email's a bombshell." I nodded, but my thoughts were still caught somewhere between anger and sadness. "Funny how lies build faster than walls," I murmured. She smiled faintly, "and fall twice as hard." As I drove home, the sunset burned crimson along the lake, the wind pushing ripples against the dam. The land was breathing again, almost like it knew it was being defended. I rolled down the window and let the cool air carry the scent of pine and wet earth. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, but for now, the silence was mine, and it felt like victory in its earliest form. I slept lightly that night, the kind of half-rest where your body's still but your mind keeps walking circles in the dark. Every creak of the old house sounded louder than usual. The rain had passed, leaving a thin fog over the lake that swallowed the moonlight. "Somewhere out there," the dam murmured, steady as a heartbeat. By dawn, I was already awake, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold before I remembered to drink it. Today wasn't just another court date. It was the day the story would either collapse under its own weight or set things right for good. I parked outside the courthouse just as the first streaks of sun reached the steeple. Reporters stood on the steps, microphones poised, voices crisp in the cool morning. They called out my name, but I kept walking. I wasn't here for headlines. I was here for closure. Inside, Sarah waited by the bench, flipping through her binder one last time. Her eyes were steady, but her jaw worked tight. "You ready, Jake?" "As ready as I'll ever be," I said. "Let's finish this." When the gavel struck, the room filled with a hush that carried the weight of months of tension. The jurors filed in, their faces unreadable, but something about the way they avoided Bethany's gaze told me they'd seen enough. Bethany sat at her table, the picture of composure in a white blouse that caught the courtroom lights. Her lawyers whispered fast, their pages rustling like dry leaves. Preston Hale, the developer, had finally been subpoenaed. He looked as slick as the day he broke ground on Red Maple Estates, though a touch paler around the eyes. Judge Ramirez nodded to Sarah. "You may proceed with your closing statement." Sarah stood, the silence amplifying every word she spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case isn't about fences or pools. It's about honesty, about whether truth still matters when paper and money try to bury it." She held up the map, the original yellowed deed from 1974. "This isn't nostalgia. It's evidence. This land has memory. Its boundaries don't shift with someone's ambition." Then she lifted the newer survey, its crisp edges sharp under the fluorescent light. "This document was signed by a man who was already dead. That's not a mistake. That's a cover-up. My client didn't just defend his property. He defended the very idea that the law still means something in this county." The courtroom was still when she finished, the kind of silence that pulls your heartbeat up into your throat. Clarkson rose next, his voice smooth as lacquer. "No one disputes that errors were made," he began, pacing slow, measured. "But is it truly fraud, or is it the natural confusion of progress? The world moves forward, and sometimes lines blur. Are we to punish success because it grew over an old fence post?" He gestured toward me. "Mr. Remy isn't the victim of deceit. He's simply unwilling to accept that time changes things." I met his eyes, and he looked away first. Sarah's rebuttal was short but cut clean. "Time doesn't change ownership. Paper doesn't change truth. And progress doesn't excuse theft." When the judge called for a recess before the verdict, the clouds outside had begun to gather again. A gust swept dust through the courthouse doorway, and with it came that unmistakable scent of rain on old wood. I stepped out onto the steps, the world moving in slow motion, the murmurs, the shuffle of reporters, the courthouse flag snapping against the wind. Beside me, Sarah spoke softly. "Whatever happens, we've already exposed them. That's something no verdict can undo." She was right. Still, I wanted the law to say it out loud. The jury returned mid-afternoon, faces drawn but calm. The foreman handed a folded slip to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Ramirez. He read quietly, then looked up over his glasses. "This court finds that the 1974 Remy deed and accompanying federal dam records establish lawful ownership of the disputed property. The 2011 HOA survey is hereby declared fraudulent and void." A murmur swept through the crowd. The judge's voice held steady, like riverstone. Further, the court finds that multiple structures within Red Maple Estates were built upon land legally owned by Mr. Remy. Remedies and compensation will be determined in subsequent proceedings. For a second, nobody moved. Then the room erupted, a low rumble of whispers and the click of cameras. Sarah squeezed my shoulder once, firm, grounding. Bethany's mask cracked then, just a flicker, but enough. Her hand trembled as she gathered her papers. Preston Hale leaned in to whisper something, but she shook her head sharply, eyes fixed on the desk. The courthouse doors opened, and the first gust of rain-laced wind swept through, scattering loose sheets of paper from the tables. Dozens of pages swirled into the air, flashing white under the fluorescent lights before tumbling to the floor. One landed by my boot, the fake survey, its seal smudged and broken. I picked it up and handed it to the clerk. "You might want to file that where it belongs," I said, "under fiction." Outside, thunder rolled across the valley, echoing against the ridges. The air smelled of wet earth and justice. Reporters tried to catch me again, but I kept walking, hat pulled low, boots steady on the steps. Sarah caught up halfway down. "They'll appeal," she warned. "Let them," I said. "Truth doesn't mind the light." Back home, the rain came full force, drumming on the tin roof, washing dust from the fields. I walked out to the dam and watched the runoff spill through the gate, a clean silver ribbon cutting across dark rock. Water has its own kind of judgment. It finds the lowest point, fills it, and moves on. I stood there a long time, hat dripping, eyes on the current. The papers had fallen, and with them every lie that tried to change the land beneath my feet. By the next morning, the storm had moved east, leaving the sky rinsed clean and pale as steel. The air smelled of pine and wet dirt, the kind of smell that makes a man believe things can start over. I brewed a pot of coffee and set the radio low, listening to the morning news. They were already talking about the verdict. Words like fraud, historic ruling, and landmark case floated through the static. I turned it off before they reached my name. Peace never lasts long. By noon, 2 black SUVs rolled up the drive, tires hissing on the damp gravel. The doors opened in unison. Bethany stepped out first, flanked by her attorney and another man I didn't recognize. Tall, sharp suit, the kind of person who smelled of cologne and courtrooms. "Mr. Remy," Bethany began, her voice brittle but careful, "we'd like to discuss settlement terms before this becomes more complicated." I leaned against the porch railing, coffee mug warm in my hand. "The court already made it simple," I said. "Those houses sit on my land." The tall man spoke next. "We represent several homeowners who are willing to compensate you generously in exchange for permanent easement rights. You'll receive monthly payments, full maintenance coverage, and non-disclosure clauses to ensure everyone's privacy." "Privacy," I repeated, looking past them toward the lake. "That's one way to call it." Bethany's eyes flicked toward the dam, the reflection of sunlight turning them cold. "We're not your enemies, Jake. Let's be reasonable." "Reasonable?" I said, keeping my voice low. "You built on stolen ground, forged papers, and called me a trespasser. I don't remember reason being invited to that conversation." Her attorney cleared his throat. "If this escalates into a damages claim, both sides will suffer. It's in everyone's interest to avoid more litigation." I finished my coffee, set the mug down on the rail. Litigation's just paper. Land's older than paper. Silence stretched until Bethany sighed, the first sound of something human breaking through. "Then you leave us no choice but to appeal." "You do that," I said. "Just remember, appeals don't change coordinates." They turned without another word, the crunch of gravel fading into distance. I watched the SUVs climb the hill, sun glinting off their roofs until they disappeared into the pines. Later that afternoon, Sarah arrived with a folder tucked under her arm. She wore sunglasses against the glare, hair pulled back tight. "You handled that well," she said, stepping onto the porch. "They came here hoping I'd trade principle for convenience." "That's what people with money always try first," she said, handing me the folder. "Here's the official compensation order from Judge Ramirez. You own partial title to 5 properties. The homeowners can either pay fair market rent for encroachment or remove their structures. Your call." I thumbed through the documents, maps, legal phrasing, valuation tables. "How much rent we talking?" "Enough to make you comfortable for the rest of your life," she said. "But it's not about money, is it?" I looked past her to the lake, the dam gleaming under the afternoon light. "No," I said. "It's about remembering who the land belonged to before the ink dried wrong." The following weeks blurred into a steady rhythm of signatures and phone calls. Reporters still called, but I ignored them. Each mansion owner, one by one, came forward, Some angry, some embarrassed, some almost humble. They signed lease agreements that turned me into their landlord. I didn't gloat. The truth didn't need noise. Bethany was the last to come. She arrived alone one evening, just as the sky turned gold. She stood by the gate, papers in hand, the faintest tremor in her posture. "Do you want to come inside?" I asked. She shook her head. "Let's keep this at the gate." She held out the signed lease, a yearly payment for her pool and tennis court. Her nails were perfect, but her hand shook just slightly when she passed me the pen. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said. "Preston told us the lines were clear. I believed him." "Belief's easy," I said. "It's proof that's hard." She looked down, voice soft. "I suppose the land always knew. We just didn't listen." For a moment, I saw not the HOA president, but a tired woman trying to hold a world built too fast. "Listening's free," I said. "Start there." She nodded, left the papers, and walked back to her car without another word. The taillights disappeared over the ridge, leaving only the hum of crickets and the slow ripple of the lake. That night, I sat at my kitchen table under the warm light of the old lamp. The signed leases lay stacked beside my coffee, edges crisp and final. I thought of my father, the way he'd shake his head at all this, proud and angry in equal measure. Outside, thunder rolled far off, just enough to rattle the windows. The smell of rain drifted in, mixing with the scent of pine and ink. I walked to the door and looked out over the land, the red flags gone, the fences standing straight, the dam glinting like an old scar healed clean. Judge Ramirez's words echoed in my head. Truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand long enough to be seen. The verdict had turned to stone, the water to reflection. Justice, I realized, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just quiet endurance, the kind that kept flowing, steady as the dam I'd built half a lifetime ago. Spring came slow to the valley that year. The snow melted off the ridges in long silver threads, feeding the reservoir until it shimmered like a sheet of polished glass. The lake had its own rhythm again, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was fighting the current. Every morning, I'd make my coffee and walk down to the water. The air would smell like pine and wet soil, the kind of scent that carries both memory and forgiveness. From the ridge above, I could see the line of houses, the ones that used to cast long shadows over my land. They still stood there, but they no longer loomed. They looked smaller now, humbled by truth and time. Bethany's rent check arrived each month, neat and punctual, her name written in careful cursive. I didn't gloat when I deposited it. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about restoring the balance that should have never been broken. Marcus and I had repainted the boundary markers bright red, easy to see even from the road. Ernest joked that the color matched my stubbornness. Sometimes Bethany herself would walk down to the fence line, her heels sinking into the dirt, a far cry from the sharp woman who once crossed my driveway with a clipboard like a sword. She didn't say much those days, just nodded politely, commented on the weather, or asked about the dam's maintenance schedule. Once she even thanked me for letting her keep the tennis court. "You take good care of what you've got now," I told her. "I learned that the hard way," she said, with a small, rueful smile. Sarah visited on weekends when she could, parking her dusty Subaru beside my truck. She'd sit on the porch swing with me, papers spread across her lap, a thermos of coffee between us. "Judge Ramirez's rulings being cited in 3 new cases," she told me one morning, the breeze lifting her hair. "Developers are nervous now. GPS evidence changed the game." "Good," I said. "Maybe next time they'll check twice before burying the truth." She looked up at the dam, sunlight catching on the metal rail. You realize you started something bigger than this ranch, right? I smiled faintly. Didn't mean to. Just wanted to keep what was mine. That's how all the right fights start, she said. By early summer, the land had healed. Grass grew thick where survey stakes once stood. Ernest planted a row of cottonwoods near the fence, said they'd mark the edge of honesty better than any deed. Some of the HOA residents began renting small garden plots from me, tending vegetables in soil that had once been part of the green space they fined me for. It was funny, in a poetic way. Every now and then a reporter would call, asking for a quote or a photo. I always said the same thing. The story's over. The land speaks for itself. They never quite understood, but that was fine. Stories like this don't belong in headlines. They belong in dirt, in roots, in quiet, mornings that keep on coming. One evening, as the sun set low and red over the lake, I took a slow walk to the dam. The air buzzed with summer gnats, the faint hum of power lines running along the ridge. The water shimmered bronze under the fading light. I stood on the spillway, the place where all the trouble began, and thought about everything that had happened, how quickly a man's peace can be disturbed, and how hard it is to win it back. From behind me came footsteps on the gravel. It was Bethany. She stopped a few paces away, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "You know," she said, "I used to think people like you were stuck in the past. Turns out you were just holding the map the rest of us forgot how to read." I turned, meeting her eyes. "Maps don't change," I said. "People just stop looking at them." She nodded, looking out over the water. "You ever regret it? Any of it?" "Not a day," I said. The fight wasn't about land. It was about remembering what's real. She lingered for a moment, then walked back up the trail toward the subdivision lights. Her figure disappeared into the dusk, leaving only the sound of frogs and wind. When the last light drained from the sky, I sat down on the dam wall, listening to the steady rush of water below. The stars came out one by one, scattered across the black mirror of the lake. Somewhere far off, an owl called, and the night folded around the land like an old, familiar coat. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the deed, creased, worn, the ink faded but still legible. I laid it flat on my knee, tracing my father's signature with my thumb. He'd built this place on work, on patience, on knowing where things begin and end. I smiled and whispered to the dark, "You were right, old man." Boundaries aren't about keeping people out. They're about knowing where you stand. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet pine and rain again. The dam groaned softly, alive as ever. I folded the deed, slipped it back into my pocket, and stood. The lake shimmered in the moonlight, every ripple a reflection of what was rightfully restored. As I headed back toward the house, the porch light glowed warm through the fog. My boots left clean prints in the damp soil, lines of truth, carved by time and stubbornness. Behind me, the water whispered against the stones, as if it remembered too. If you've ever had to fight for what's rightfully yours, you know what that kind of peace feels like when justice finally settles in. Drop a simple justice down below if you'd stand your ground too. I'd love to hear your story. And if this one hit home, stick around and hit subscribe. There are more stories of grit, land, and quiet redemption waiting right here by the lake.